Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our session. This is a panel discussion on the topic of health. The panel chair, which I will introduce, is Greg Versteeg. Greg is a research team lead at the USC Information Sciences Institute and a research associate professor in computer science. Greg?
Hey, hi, good morning, everybody. Yeah, I'm very excited to get this panel going and to hear from our health experts who represent a quite amazing swath of the really broad landscape of things in the health and AI space. So, you know, from hearing talks like the one we just heard from Regina, you have this feeling like we could just scrape some data together and sprinkle some AI magic on everything and start saving lives right away. So it's not always quite that easy. And I think we're going to hear about part of the reason that this is so challenging. There's this very long pipeline between, you know, something happens in the clinic and we collect some data and then we put that data into our AI and it gives out a number, and then we're going to take that number and we're going to try to make a decision about what kind of treatment you should have, you know, to give yourself the best outcomes. So the number of things that can go wrong in that whole sequence is quite daunting. And, you know, we have experts who are, you know, representing a lot of different parts of that pipeline, and we'll get to hear from them about what can go wrong and what we might be able to do about this. So I will quickly introduce these panelists, and we'll hear a little bit from each of them, and then start a discussion, and then a little later on, you know, we can have questions from the audience. Okay, so the first panelist is Neda Jahanshad. She's a professor of neurology, and I know her best for this work in the Enigma Consortium, which is this worldwide brain imaging study. And she leads this, the group that is trying to introduce new imaging modalities. Diffusion tensor imaging, which if you've never heard about it, is a super cool new technology for doing imaging. And so she knows all about, you know, the challenges in, you know, getting a new device out there, scanning some people, and then trying to learn something new about the brain from all of that. I remember being in a meeting with her once, and I took the train home. I don't miss taking the train at all, but I do miss being able to run into people like Neda. And I was just like looking over someone's shoulder to see what they were reading, and which is a weird thing to do, I guess. There's this full page picture of Neda, and it was this magazine that has done like one of those profile pieces about rising stars in neuroscience. So that was a fun observation. Okay, so the second panelist that I want to introduce is Daniella Meeker. So she's a professor in the Department of Preventive Medicine and Pediatrics, and she's also director of the Clinical Research Informatics program at USC. And to me, this clinical part is the key word here. That you know, often in AI, we're so far removed from like what's actually happening in clinics that this can be a real problem. So my first PhD student was wanting to do deep learning with healthcare data, with electronic health records. And we were very lucky that he knew people like Daniella, because the number of things that can go wrong with clinical health data is way more than I ever could have imagined. So, you know, I think we'll get to hear more from her about that angle. And then last we have Peter Kuhn. So he's the Dean's Professor of Biological Sciences and Professor of Medicine, Biomedical Engineering, and Aerospace and Mechanical Engineering. So that's a long list of things, and why would you ever need to know about so many things? And I think the reason is that he's very interested in understanding cancer, and there's a lot going on in understanding every aspect of how cancer works to, you know, to ultimately improve patient care. So I was really lucky to visit his nice new lab on campus back before everything went sideways, and I find it very comforting to talk to Peter, because he has his background in physics, which really comes through when you talk to him. So it's sort of like you have these like insanely complicated problems, and you just keep breaking it down into smaller and smaller pieces until you have trivial problems. And so I really like this way of looking at the world, which comes through whenever you talk to him. So I'm going to have each of the panelists go through and just give kind of an introduction to their angle on this topic, and then we'll start our discussion. So I'll start with Neda.
Thanks so much, Greg, and thanks so much for that introduction. Yeah, I try not to think about that magazine. As Greg mentioned, I work a lot on neuroimaging, new technologies in neuroimaging. What I'm going to focus on today is more an argument against an area where I see AI used a lot in neurosciences, in neurology and psychiatry in particular. So what we see a lot of is are people interested in using available data like brain scans to classify whether someone has a certain condition or not. And today I'm just going to give like a couple minutes my views on why that's not a really valuable use of AI. So if you take a very popular neuroimaging data set, let's say it's called the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative. So ADNI has been around for a very long time, something like 15 years now. I just did a quick PubMed search to see how many people have used ADNI for diagnosis classification using machine learning or deep learning as key terms. There are nearly 200 PubMed papers that use this data for classification. And one thing I'd like to point out is that one of the reasons this isn't really a very fruitful sort of application of AI is because the definition of some of these disorders are changing over time. So Alzheimer's today is not the same definition as it was 5 years ago even. So now we have new tests and new technologies to better detect more biologically relevant features of Alzheimer's. And dementia alone or cognitive impairment doesn't define Alzheimer's anymore. So the systems we built to classify Alzheimer's based on old data is meaningless today. So that's basically what I'm focusing on. If we go back and look at that initial data set to see, okay, so from the data collected over 10 years ago, from the people who were classified as having Alzheimer's, nearly 15% of them don't have the biological marker now that defines Alzheimer's. So that's a big chunk of people who were misdiagnosed. Now, we don't actually have effective treatments for Alzheimer's. But if we did, you could see why that 15% would be subjected to treatments that would not work because they were misdiagnosed, and it would be a misclassification, and our AI systems would be completely wrong. And also, it's important to note that they're not always a single pathology. So just because you have Alzheimer's disease doesn't mean you don't have like Lewy body dementia or other forms of brain conditions that might complicate the treatment plan or anything else or the classification. So so my team also does a lot in psychiatry. We work a lot with different groups that work on psychiatric disorders, and there are often comorbid conditions. So depression with anxiety might not necessarily be the same profile as depression without anxiety, for example. And one thing to keep in mind is that just classifying these disorders doesn't always lead to the most pressing problem. So many disorders might have a similar symptom or condition or behavior that needs urgent attention and is not necessarily tied to that diagnosis. For example, individuals with various mental health conditions are at higher risk for suicidal attempts. And that doesn't mean that people who are undiagnosed with these conditions are not at risk. But these symptoms are common across these different diagnoses. So why are we arbitrarily trying to classify different diagnoses when maybe we should be focusing on subtypes of diagnoses, if that can lead to better treatment and better care? I think if I have one more minute, I'd just like to say that the classification is also only as good as the tools that we have to actually test. So as we're advancing technologies for better detection, we can see that something that's undetectable doesn't necessarily mean it's non-existent. So let's take HIV, for example. If you're taking antiretrovirals, you might be undetectable for HIV, but that's because you're being treated, and if just because it's not detectable with the current tools that we have, doesn't mean that virus isn't there. It just doesn't meet the threshold for detection. So I think these are some things to keep in mind as we're building AI tools, is that we do need to continuously refine our definitions of the conditions, and maybe focus on problems related to how we can best treat individuals regardless of diagnoses, and what treatments might work best for what individuals. So I think I'll stop there, but that was just mainly my spiel, and let's stop trying to classify disease versus not.
Awesome. Yes, thanks. I think that's wonderful. And I think this idea that we have this data coming into our AI systems, and if we don't really know what those things mean, like the labels, they might be shifting over time. This is a big problem, and I think we're going to hear more about this from Daniella. So take it away, Daniella.
Yeah, while I pull my slides up, I think this is a great segue. I came from a universe where I was using AI to develop brain-computer interfaces. When dinosaurs roamed the earth and NIPS was still called NIPS and not whatever it's called now. And I did a postdoc with the person that's now the acting dean of the policy school, Dana Goldman, and I had come with a lot of optimism about how to work with this kind of large data set that we collect in the process of delivering healthcare, and how we might repurpose some of the machine learning algorithms for predicting better health outcomes and the kinds of treatments that might optimally address those outcomes. I think it was a very steep learning curve. I had a lot of misinformation that I had to overcome and assumptions that I had to overcome. But the benefit of working with people that are in the health economics field is that they really think a lot about how to marry these kinds of found data sets that we're working with in order to better develop causal inference. And we've heard a little bit about causal inference over the past couple days, and I will be speaking to some of the things that might be possibilities in healthcare. So really quickly, there seems to be sort of, we've reached kind of the Gartner trough of disillusionment in healthcare using these real world data to try to predict the best treatments and what might happen to patients. One of my favorite incidental findings is that mortality is very well predicted by a visit of a chaplain to a patient, and these kinds of obvious correlations are also lined up with calibration of AI algorithms, where things like the brand of an MRI machine is a better predictor of the outcome than any of the clinical factors. And that just has to do with the fact that the trauma center that's in your data set is actually using a different kind of MRI machine than the community hospital. The other issue that I think is important to touch on is that these algorithms in the real world have very limited uptake, especially at the point of care, and the adoption has been pretty low. So some of the things that people are thinking about in this space is how to improve decision making, but also improve the way that we drive the kinds of adoption of these tools using the kinds of frameworks that are already existent in health IT. So a question that a lot of people that know that I work in this space have asked is, like, why aren't we just doing A/B testing the same way that all of our consumer technology is used? And there's kind of two answers to that. The first one is that it's impossible, and the second one is that it's happening all the time. And trying to understand what we mean by these two possibilities and how to make it more likely that it will happen all the time, and also leverage what's already in place with these real world data sets is part of what I think the future of the applied machine learning and AI space in healthcare might look like. So the origins of A/B frameworks in technology actually comes from clinical trials, and trying to bring that around full circle would involve taking an approach to health information technology that is lined up with the kinds of A/B testing we do with user design for consumer technology. So you have a couple treatments you're trying to compare. You flip a coin. Patient gets assigned to a treatment randomly, and then you measure the outcome. And this works great in closed systems like software testing. The randomization in particular really helps to address the kind of noise that you might get from other factors influencing the outcomes. And the volume of information that you can obtain in a software testing setting is obviously very high. We would think that would be also true in healthcare, but there's a number of different things that limit this. So the first and most important thing is that the data that we have in healthcare is not generally randomized. There's a lot of selection bias that goes into what treatment a patient may obtain. The other big problem is that the outcomes that we're measuring are often missing. A statistic that a lot of people use is that 50% of hospital readmissions are to hospitals other than the index admission. So we have really confusing information and incomplete information about what's actually happening to a patient after they've received a treatment. And finally, there's a lot of unobserved factors influencing the patient outcomes. They are environmental, and they have to do with other treatments that they might be on, and that's particularly challenging when you cannot randomize. The other issue that has made a lot of headlines lately is exactly how people are trying to overcome this outcome problem using the data that's available. This science paper was making headlines around showing that an algorithm that had been trained on a large claims data set was not using real clinical needs as the outcome, but they were using the costs that each patient had over time. And the implicit assumption in the algorithm was that patients that have higher healthcare expenditures are the ones that have the greatest healthcare need. And because not all patients have equal access to healthcare, and cost influences whether people use healthcare, they incorrectly identified minority patients and patients with less generous health insurance as the ones that had less need, as opposed to what I think most clinicians would tell you generally would benefit from more complete healthcare engagement. So the other side of this coin, though, is that there are A/B experiments happening all the time in healthcare, and I don't mean clinical trials. I mean just the variation that is happening frequently in healthcare. But we have to identify when those kinds of experiments are happening based on these very large, messy data sets. But the basic premise of this kind of inference is that patients get randomly assigned or semi-randomly assigned to physicians, or assigned in a way that is not necessarily associated with either the treatment or the outcome. And there's things related to physician practices and policies and operations that impact what the physicians are doing in a predictable way. And there's also things like health IT design that unintentionally influences decision making. You can just think about what the default options are for a drop-down list and things like that that have been shown to have a big influence. So the bread and butter of health economics is trying to tease those things apart. And I don't know if you guys saw all the types of paper flurrying around this weekend, but there was one that was focused on health economics, kind of making fun of the things that we tend to publish. And this center one here, weird stuff is happening in my claims database. That is often where a lot of these machine learning type papers originate. I've got a database. I want to show you some patterns. Here's some things that are my machine learning algorithm can do. There was actually another version of this that was about bioinformatics, and every single panel was my machine learning algorithm outperforms your machine learning algorithm. However, I think that some of the things that are demonstrated here are probably also of interest. The first is that the objective function in healthcare is not really health. It really has to do with the underlying economics of clinical decision making. And oops, let me get back here. Yeah. So this paper is sort of looking at how frequently the pseudo paper is looking at how frequently people use instrumental variables analysis to try to understand causal inference. And I think instrumental variables analysis is just a fancy way of saying natural experiment. And there's some more rigor behind it than that, but that presents some opportunities. And we saw Dr. Wing's presentation on Monday, where she highlighted some of the work that has been done in looking at the patterns of healthcare. So it's one step to characterize these different patterns, and then a second step is looking at whether those patterns are associated with an instrument or a natural experiment that you can then use to infer causality from those different patterns. So not just looking at the associations, but trying to get at some of the causality. And I went back, and one of the conferences that Jose Luis organized a few years ago was a meeting where I presented a paper with Cheryl Hsu that we worked on applying a combination of these causal inference methods with sequential pattern mining methods to try to get a better sense of what kinds of patterns of treatment are most associated with better than expected outcomes and worse than expected outcomes. So things that are positive and negative deviance can be safety or efficacy signals. Finally, the other kind of panel that was highlighted here is in the health econ paper set was applying behavioral economics to healthcare, and that's another big area of research that I do. And I will just sort of confess that I recognize myself in some of these. The one of the studies that we've looked at is predicting medical errors, and sometimes the predictions are pretty obvious. When people are tired, they make worse decisions. However, some of the things that are a little bit less predictable, and you have to use some more complex modeling to tease apart what might be happening, especially looking at the hierarchical effects and distinguishing physician level effects from structural effects. We see that in this error is actually driven a lot by implicit bias. So if you look at the left panel here, you can see that this error, which is an increase in opioid prescribing, is actually driven primarily by an increase in opioid prescribing over time to white patients, and actually a decrease in opioid prescribing over time as physicians get more tired to minorities. And so these kinds of patterns in the data use a combination of looking at things that might be considered classical statistics with things that are more related to pattern mining. So I think that one of the things I would like to just close with is some of the opportunities that we might have, and just to say that there's several different ways, and I'll leave it for the discussion to talk to what the other things we might do with this kind of methodology might be.
Yeah, thanks Daniella. Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing your input on. So on our last person we're going to hear from is Peter. And so he's going to, we've seen like a lot of big problems here, causality and implicit biases and confounding. So that could really make you doubt whether, how we're going to use this data in a way that we can trust for making healthcare decisions. So I think Peter is going to present a positive, if daunting, view of what that might look like. And I'm really eager to hear what our other panelists think of this vision. Go ahead, Peter.
Thanks, Ray. No, this is great. This was probably my favorite introduction of all times. The idea of creating a better tomorrow, we're breaking down the challenges into trivial problems to be solved today. I love that. And I think what we have heard throughout this meeting, but in particular now in this last session, we are at a really, really important point in time where all of us have to come together and actually think about, hey, this is now the real world. What are the actual problems we're trying to solve? And I would have loved to talk to Regina forever and ever, because of course I'm a recovering structure-based drug design guy coming out of the experimental world. And how that actually interfaces with structure prediction and how that has evolved over time is really important to wrap our head around, but it ties right into with what Daniella was just saying. So the problem of patenting a molecule, that's not what's driving the cost of the drug. It's actually critical to have an investment thesis for somebody to put in $1 billion to convert that molecule through the necessary clinical trials into a viable drug so that the diseases that Neda is trying to characterize can actually be treated. So if we would take IP away from the molecule, we would take the investment thesis away, we would never make drugs again unless some new system starts emerging. Okay, so we have to be conscious of that, right? The idea of like where you could say, okay, I'm going to publish all 10 to the 60th drug molecules now, and hence there is no patentable entity anymore, and that will have reduced drug prices. Well, no, you've just taken away the marketplace. Similarly, I think we have to become conscious when we oftentimes say, I am going to recommend the best treatment for the patient. So all of us who are mere PhDs, no license to practice medicine, right? We have to take one more step in our thought process, despite the fact that we will never make a medical recommendation. That's really important for us to recognize. We're not licensed to do so. And oftentimes we are hiding behind that. But I think it's important for us to recognize, to say, wait a minute, what if that patient actually takes my recommendation and changes their treatment plan? And what if I'm actually wrong? Which of course gets us a little bit to the way Daniella actually framed the problem was really, really important, right? What's our reward function? Is it health? Is it money? Whichever way around, the problem with health is in fact, and again, I'm thinking of diseases like cancer. Any of the chronic diseases would work just fine, where in fact, just because you take a drug and you end up surviving the disease does not mean that the drug was the actual reason for that. Vice versa, eventually you will still die. It doesn't mean that you died because of the drug, right? So this is the imprecise part, right? So Regina talked a lot about the precise, because again, structure-based drug design can be in fact quite precise. I can in fact prove to a pretty good degree whether or not my AI-driven approach leads me to the correct result. In fact, again, there's a lot of criticism around randomized controlled clinical trials. And I'm like, well, but come up with something better. Because where do you actually prove that a drug molecule or any intervention has made a difference in the outcome of that particular patient, that one patient? And that is what I want to put forward as sort of a thought concept, right? So as these AIs are being built out, now just imagine a scenario, right, where, you know, we have this beautiful image interpretation AI. That's what AIs are really, really good at, right? We built them in radiology, we built them in pathology, all over the place, right? And of course, you know, we could very well revolutionize concepts around early cancer detection. Take really hard to diagnose cancers like ovarian cancer. Now, whether that's the interpretation of a pap smear, the idea of using menstrual blood, there's all kinds of ways of thinking about that. Okay, so now let's take a scenario, we fast forward, these AIs are being implemented the way we envision, right? As engineers, we build a brilliant AI and boom, the clinic uses it. In fact, now they're starting to be transparent as well in terms of the feature selection and all of that, right? That's important, it's explainable, it's understandable. Okay, so patient walks in, the AI says, you're cancer-free, you go home. Well, beautiful. Patient comes back 18 months later and is now being diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. And the patient is asked the question, well, what just happened? Well, in fact, she's going for a second opinion. Now, this time around, the second opinion, of course, is AI number 2. That existed 18 months ago. And AI number 2, different physician uses that, or different e-health platform for all I care. We have eliminated the physicians, right? The AI is making the decision. And that AI would have said 18 months ago, no, actually, you have early stage ovarian cancer. Curative intent intervention. Okay, black and white. Curative intent in the early stage setting. Recently, black and white, nothing is really black and white, but 18 months later, stage 4 disease, that the patient will die. Okay, 6 months later, patient has now died, and the relatives are filing a lawsuit. Misdiagnosis. And in fact, you, the developer, is being sued. Because you, the developer, stepped forward and said, my AI is making the decision, not the treating physician. And remember, the treating physician is very quickly in no position to evaluate number 1 versus number 2. And this is where I would like to start this conversation of how do we, again, we have to break this down into solvable problems, right? If we just say, oh my God, this is crazy, I want to have nothing to do with this. No, that's wrong. These are real problems. We want to solve them, right? We want to make progress. We really want to advance this space. But how do we go about this so that we step away from like, well, my AI is better than your AI, or, well, I'm a PhD student in computer science, I must invent a new AI, as opposed to actually, no, I must solve a problem. And if I solve a problem, it might not fit neatly into my old requirements for a degree or a paper or whatever, but I'm actually working towards solving a problem. So I'll pause there and turn it back to Greg to start the conversation.
No, yeah, I'm very taken with this this vision of like really making it concrete by putting the AI researchers on the spot and saying, you know, now suddenly you're being sued for this. But so I'm very eager to hear from Neda and Daniella about this vision. Like, is this possible to, you know, I mean, there's so many different ways to think of it. Listening to you three, I hadn't realized the importance of incentives and economics in any of this. That part already blows my mind. And then this other question that Peter ended on also seems really, I'm having a hard time breaking down the pieces of it in that I don't know how we would break down every part of this pipeline enough that we could be confident about like the reason. And maybe it's not just the reason, it's like I mean, it's a little stronger than reason. It's like a justification for why the AI did this, in the way that a doctor who is being sued in the exact same situation could say, well, look, I used best practices here and I based it on this and this, and this isn't malpractice because of that. So Yeah, anyway, so maybe either Daniella or Neda, please jump in if you had some thoughts about this.
So I would just say that one of the problems that you brought up, Peter, among many, is this issue of calibration and approval and generalizability. And I do think that you're kind of suggesting that there might be a policy framework or an evaluation framework that should apply in these cases in order to develop confidence in some kind of collaboration between AI and humans, or these different algorithms, understanding how one performs versus the other and in what context they were developed. There's been a lot of work on calibration. There's been less work on sort of a policy or evaluation framework that could go all the way through to FDA level decision making around approving these kinds of tools. And I'm curious if any of you guys on the panel sort of have some ideas about what that might look like, if there's a advocacy around that we should be focusing on as people that are both developers and possibly promoters or detractors even.
I'm happy to chime in because it is really important to, again, for all of us in this space to, for starters, actually follow that train of thought that Daniella just had, because these keywords about FDA approval, don't say that's something for other people to do. Okay, recognize that it's actually us, right? If we really want to change something, right, the only way this is going to happen, right, if it reaches the actual patient. And the way it reaches the patient is by generating an approvable and reimbursable product, bottom line, okay? Now, we have to keep in mind that when we talk about EHR data, for example, why is the EHR world so complex, if one would not want to use a much stronger set of language? Well, because that's in fact not really regulated, okay? It's a set of databases, it's a set of databases that were thrown together. There is no formal FDA approval. Okay, there is software process regulatory frameworks, right? But no quality approvals of any sorts. I think there is one module that has I think a 510K approval, and that I think is the blood banking module within the EHR, but everything else is just the Wild West, other than making sure that software development processes are followed, but none of the intelligence. So none of this is built for that. So we have to really now start reimagining in a new world where we follow what Daniella was just saying, approvable. FDA has to be able, from a regulatory, and this is going to take lots of policy, but this policy, again, it has to be enabling to get to regulatory approval. And we on the development side, all of us, have to understand and embrace what that actually means so that we can solve real problems.
I think that's a really great point. And I also want to highlight what Peter and Danielle both mentioned is about this transparency aspect, and maybe not only transparency of what's being done, but also what's not being done. Like what data is not being used. Like maybe we're not screening for cancer, which is why that person was not diagnosed with cancer. But having that all together can build more effective systems, or maybe a set of systems to essentially be more holistic for an individual.
And that's a really good point, right? Again, something we have to think through very carefully. Early cancer detection is a great example of that, where we actually have to spend time understanding the current clinical care framework, right? So the gold standard, whether it's shiny or not, is today's clinical practice. And that is very different when it comes to the different types of cancers. And we have to really start appreciating how a breast or prostate cancer is very different in terms of its early diagnosis, where a breast cancer that's being diagnosed late today has much more to do with healthcare disparities and other challenges, as opposed to our inability to detect it early. Because in fact, we have really, really good ways of detecting it early. Whereas in pancreatic cancer, part of the reason we are detecting it so late is because the screening process itself is very invasive and, well, in part dangerous in terms of what could happen during an exploratory biopsy. So it has nothing to do with the AI. It has nothing to do with looking at the tissue once it's under the microscope. No, it really has to do with the clinical practice and how the surrounding technologies are evolving. And again, important, I think, for all of us to think that through.
I think that's a really great point, and builds on sort of what I was trying to discuss is that you know, we're very limited by the tools, and a lot of the tests that are conducted might not be conducted because, you know, they're inconvenient, there's a high risk involved. So perhaps trying to build tools that might you know, be able to better predict whether certain tests are needed or not, you know, rather than, again, trying to diagnose or not, is more efficient.
Quick thing I want to mention is that if I'll be monitoring this Q&A, and I'll let people know if something comes up. So I don't see anything in there now. So, but feel free if you're watching and you wanted to you know, hone in on something, some of these great points, to do that.
Well, I think what Neda was just saying, right? Understanding whether a particular test is needed or not, we have to appreciate that we might arrive at a point after a lot of work and investigation that, oh, it's not needed. Okay, walk backwards, walk away, and go to the next problem, right? And all of that takes time. I mean, we have just gone through, we are constantly going through, as we're sitting between all of these chairs, right? Where we are trying to reach out, on the one hand, in the physics, the computer science, the biology, and the engineering, and on the other hand, with the clinical teams on the clinical intuition, the clinical care, and the patients, to bring these conversations together to actually understand, because, right, oftentimes we are still stuck with us as the PIs in this old mindset, right? It should be the science PI who has the unsolicited, who submits the unsolicited proposal, right, with our research ideas. And I think we have to ask ourselves the question, aren't we better off spending a lot of time with the clinical teams, understanding the current care framework and truly the challenges that exist within that, and use that as a starting point for the scientific investigation. We can then start doing scientific investigation and discovery within that model system of the human, within the model system of the current care framework. And then from there, eventually we can start flowing it again to the model systems. And that transition, we're in the middle of that. That's a really, really hard transition, because we are so used to going from the model systems over into the human. And that is true in wet biology and in dry biology. We do this over and over. But really what's important now is that we really start over in the clinical care framework and start really discovering there and figuring out how to move forward.
Awesome. Yeah, good point, Peter. And we're supposed to end at noon. So I want to hear like last thoughts from Daniella and Neda before we wrap up.
I'll just reinforce what Peter and Neda have said by saying I do think that there's some great opportunities to apply these methods, not just in the notion of, you know, predicting health outcomes, but in optimizing the way that we are seeking to extend our knowledge, ideally in the process of delivering healthcare. But there's possibly some old-fashioned science that still has to get done because of all the ways the system interferes with how we develop new information and new data that is actually reliable.
Awesome. Yeah, Neda.
Thanks. I just wanted to say I learned a lot from this panel in this whole 3-day session. And I think there's a lot that we can do in terms of AI for healthcare in a lot of different fields. And it's always good to connect with experts in the domains, for example, the MDs that are practicing, to know, you know, what are the problems, and not kind of make up problems that might not exist or might be, you know, might be really easy for the physician to look at a person and know. So I think this this is a really helpful discussion, and I hope there's good things that come out of it.
Awesome, thanks everybody. This was so dense. I'm gonna have to go back and watch the recording of this because there was like so many thought-provoking ideas. I only got a fraction of it. I was trying to, you know, make sure we stayed on time. So I really want to thank all my panelists again for a really interesting discussion. Thanks guys. And I'll turn it back over to Yolanda.
Thank you so much, Greg. Thank you, Daniela, Peter, Neda. Very exciting discussion in this area.